Have you ever sat across from someone who systematically tore down your confidence, manipulated your reality, or discarded you like you meant nothing, and wondered if they ever wake up in the middle of the night feeling even a single drop of remorse? We spend months, sometimes years, replaying conversations, hunting for a sign of humanity, waiting for that one honest text message or confession that says, "I know what I did to you, and I am sorry." Here is the hard, cold truth about human behavioral mechanics. They do feel it, but it isn't the kind of feeling that leads to an apology. It is something much more volatile, much darker, and far more destructive. Deep inside the hidden neural architecture of a high narcissism profile sits a quiet, agonizing reality. They are deeply, profoundly ashamed of how they treated you.
Now, I know what you're thinking. If they're ashamed, why do they act like they did nothing wrong? Why do they post pictures smiling? Why do they rewrite history and portray me as the villain? That exact contradiction is what we are decoding today. In the next few minutes, we aren't going to talk about pop psychology or surface-level relationship advice. We are going into the raw, observable mechanics of the human stress response and identity preservation. You are going to learn the exact psychological trigger that converts their hidden shame into sudden outbursts of hostility, the precise nonverbal micro-expressions they display when forced to remember your face, and the subtle, unconscious behaviors they use to suppress the memory of what they did to you. More importantly, if you stay through to the end of this breakdown, you will receive a specific behavioral framework, a mental diagnostic lens, that will instantly break the emotional hold they still have over you. Once you see the internal panic behind their stoic mask, you stop waiting for an apology you never needed in the first place, and you take full operational control of your own emotional state. So clear your mind, set aside the emotional noise, and let's dissect what is actually happening behind those eyes. When we examine human behavior under pressure, we have to look at the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is functional. Guilt is an objective assessment of an action. I made a mistake, I caused harm, and I need to recalibrate my behavior. Guilt prompts a person to move toward the victim to repair the bond. Shame, however, is a threat to survival for a narcissist. Shame isn't, "I made a mistake." Shame is, "I am exposed, I am inadequate, the illusion is breaking." To a person whose entire survival strategy is built on maintaining an unassailable image of superiority, pure shame is an existential emergency. When a narcissist looks back at how they used you, betrayed you, or demeaned you, their brain registers that memory not as a moral failing, but as a catastrophic flaw in their design. They saw you show them genuine care, honesty, and loyalty, and they responded with cruelty and exploitation. On a subterranean cognitive level, that contrast creates intense cognitive dissonance. It exposes the fact that you possess the emotional strength they will never have, and that realization terrifies them. They will never stand in front of you and say, "I ruined something good because I was insecure." Their ego cannot survive the weight of those words. But the human body is terrible at keeping secrets. When a narcissist is confronted with the memory of their past behavior toward you, watch their baseline. You won't see tears or quiet reflection. You will observe micro-signals of ego threat. Rapid subject switching. The moment your name or a shared past event comes up, watch how quickly their vocal rate accelerates as they divert the conversation. That is an escape vector. Micro-disgust cues. A brief fraction of a second twitch of the nose or asymmetrical lip retraction when forced to look at a reminder of you. That disgust isn't aimed at you. It's an automated physical reaction to the shame surging inside them. Retroactive smear campaigns. Have you ever noticed how someone who mistreated you suddenly starts spreading stories that you were the abusive one? That is preemptive self-defense. If they can convince the world and themselves that you deserved it, they don't have to carry the shame of having initiated it. Why will they never admit it?
because an admission requires an intact sense of self. Healthy human beings can say, "I was wrong," because their core identity rests on reality. A narcissist's core identity rests on a scaffold of illusions. To admit that they treated you horribly would require pulling down the entire structure. If they acknowledge the damage they did to you, they have to face every other lie they've built their life upon. So instead, they double down. They block you. They act indifferent. They adopt a demeanor of cold detachment. Understand this clearly. Cold detachment is not peace. It is a defensive perimeter. The louder their indifference, the heavier the armor they are wearing to keep the truth from breaking through. The greatest trap in recovering from a narcissistic dynamic is staying trapped in the role of the waiting party, waiting for validation, waiting for fairness, waiting for them to finally see the light and apologize. Recognize the game for what it is. Their refusal to admit what they did isn't a reflection of your worth. It is a confession of their own cowardice. They ran away from the truth because the truth was too heavy for them to carry. You do not need a confession from a compromised source to confirm your reality. You were there. You lived it. You survived it. When you shift your perspective from, "Why didn't they apologize to me?" to, "They are trapped inside a prison of their own denial forever," the dynamic instantly flips. You step out of the loop of self-doubt and step back into complete psychological sovereignty. They carry the shame. You keep the clarity. Move forward accordingly. Guilt and shame are often mistakenly conflated in mainstream discussions about toxic personalities. But from a strict behavioral analysis perspective, they operate on completely opposite neural and psychological tracks. Understanding this functional difference is the key to unlocking why someone who thoroughly mistreated you will never offer an honest confession. Guilt is an action-oriented, pro-social emotion. When a healthy human being experiences guilt, their internal monologue centers entirely on the objective act they committed and the tangible harm it caused to another person. They evaluate their behavior against an established baseline of personal values and think, "I did a bad thing, I breached trust, and my action created damage." Because guilt isolates the behavior from the self, it doesn't threaten the individual's core identity. It allows them to remain psychologically intact while stepping toward the injured party to offer a genuine apology, take accountability, and execute active measures of repair. Guilt fosters empathy because it keeps the focus external, on the victim's pain and the necessary restitution. Shame, however, operates through a vastly different and far more dangerous behavioral framework, especially within a high narcissism profile. Shame is not action-oriented, it is identity-oriented. It does not process the situation as, "I did a bad thing." Instead, shame completely bypasses the specific action and strikes directly at the core ego structure, declaring, "I am a bad thing. I am flawed. I am weak. I am exposed." For an individual who relies entirely on a manufactured image of perfection, control, and moral superiority to survive, pure, unadulterated shame represents an existential crisis. It triggers the exact same fight or flight pathways in the brain as a physical threat to survival. When memories of how badly they manipulated, used, or discarded you surface, their brain does not register those memories as a moral failing that requires an apology. It registers those memories as an unbearable threat to their fragile ego. Because shame threatens to destroy their carefully constructed self-image, a narcissist's psychological defense mechanisms instantly fire up to bury it. They cannot afford to feel shame, so they convert it almost immediately into outward hostility, cold detachment, or total denial. Where guilt drives a person toward accountability, shame forces a person into extreme self-preservation. It compels them to rewrite history, blame you for provoking them, or act as if the past simply never happened.
When they remember what they did to you, the sheer weight of that shame creates an internal panic. To admit their behavior would mean acknowledging that you held the moral high ground and that they were the bad actor in the narrative, a reality their psychological architecture is simply not built to withstand.
They do not lack the subconscious recognition of what they did. What they lack is the structural integrity to sit with that shame without completely collapsing, which is precisely why that shame remains buried beneath a wall of defiance. When analyzing high narcissism profiles, one of the most critical breakthroughs in behavioral science is recognizing that silence or a lack of verbal confession does not indicate a lack of internal disturbance. The human conscious mind is fully capable of constructing elaborate fabrications, rehearsing lies, and projecting absolute confidence, but the autonomic nervous system and subconscious mind operate under a completely different set of operational rules. While a narcissist will strictly police their spoken words to ensure they never utter a direct apology or take responsibility for how they treated you, their internal shame continuously leaks out through distinct, measurable shifts in their baseline behavior, nonverbal microexpressions, and psychological overcompensations. To identify these subterranean leaks, you must first establish an accurate behavioral baseline. The individual's normal, relaxed patterns of speech, posture, facial animation, and reaction times. When the memory of how they mistreated you is accidentally triggered, or when your name is brought up in conversation, watch for instantaneous deviations from that baseline. The subconscious mind, struggling to suppress the sudden spike of internal shame, forces the body to execute automated escape vectors. You will often observe a micro-expression of disgust, a fraction of a second nose wrinkle or asymmetrical lip retraction flashing across their face. This involuntary facial twitch is not directed at you. It is a raw, physiological reaction to the self-loathing that briefly breaches their conscious awareness before their defense mechanisms can regain control. Another prominent indicator of subconscious leakage is sudden, unprovoked behavioral overcompensation. When an individual is quietly tormented by the implicit knowledge that they acted callously, dishonestly, or abusively toward you, the shame generates an ongoing state of low-grade internal panic. Because they cannot resolve this tension through honest self-reflection, it manifests as erratic, nonverbal shifts. You might notice an aggressive spike in vocal pace, a sudden rigidness in body language, or an abrupt increase in fidgeting and spatial displacement whenever topics remotely related to past integrity are raised. Their system is actively working overtime to process a threat, and that threat is the memory of their own past conduct. Furthermore, these subconscious leaks frequently drive them toward preemptive self-defense mechanisms long after you have moved on. They may randomly launch microattacks, post indirect slights, or initiate sudden smear campaigns without any recent interaction having occurred. To an untrained observer, this looks like random cruelty, but through a diagnostic behavioral lens, it is clear evidence of a leak. The memory of their mistreatment of you suddenly surfaced, causing a wave of shame, and their psychological apparatus reacted by instantly projecting that shame outward into aggression. They are attempting to reconvince the world, and desperately reconvince themselves, that you were the bad actor, purely because their subconscious mind cannot peacefully carry the reality of what they actually did. The absolute refusal of a narcissist to admit to their past mistreatment is not an indicator of cold indifference. It is a rigid, desperate attempt at identity preservation. To understand why an admission is psychologically impossible for them, you have to dissect the underlying architecture of the narcissistic persona. A healthy, emotionally mature individual builds their identity upon an internal foundation of self-acceptance, authentic self-awareness, and a realistic tolerance for their own human flaws. They can look back at past mistakes, acknowledge harm caused, and say, "I acted terribly in that situation," without their entire self-concept dissolving. Their psychological house is built on ground solid enough to absorb the shock of personal accountability. In stark contrast, a narcissist's identity is entirely artificial, highly fragmented, and built upon a fragile outer shell designed to project absolute moral superiority, grandiosity, and faultlessness. Deep within their core lies a deep-seated fracture, an overwhelming, repressed fear of being flawed, weak, or insignificant. To survive this internal void, they spend their entire lives erecting and constantly maintaining an unassailable false narrative where they are perpetually the victim, the hero, or the superior party in every interaction. Every piece of their psychological security depends on the absolute maintenance of this fiction. When a narcissist looks back at how they treated you, how they manipulated, belittled, lied to, or discarded someone who offered them genuine care and loyalty, it presents a direct, catastrophic threat to that false narrative. Admitting to you, or even privately admitting to themselves, that they behaved maliciously requires them to breach that protective shell. It forces them to look at the brutal contrast between the pristine image they project and the destructive reality of their actual actions. The human mind will go to extreme lengths to avoid the complete destruction of its core identity, and for a narcissist, acknowledging how they treated you would cause that exact structural collapse. This is why any attempt to bring them to a moment of honest self-scrutiny triggers an intense, defensive panic. To acknowledge their mistreatment of you would mean pulling down the primary pillar supporting their entire fabricated reality. It would require them to admit that they were the cause of the breakdown, that they lacked emotional maturity, and that their behavior was governed by deep insecurity rather than strength. Their fragile ego simply cannot survive that level of exposure. Instead of allowing that identity fracture to be seen, their brain deploys immediate psychological armor. They double down on denial, rewrite the timeline of events, or cast you as the irrational instigator who forced their hand. This extreme rewriting of history is an unconscious survival strategy to protect their fragile self-image from cracking open. Their silence and total lack of admission are not signs that they have moved on with a clear conscience, but rather proof that the truth of what they did to you is far too heavy for their artificial identity to bear. In the field of high-stakes behavioral observation, one of the most reliable indicators that a suspect or subject is internally compromised is the phenomenon of preemptive deflection. When a narcissist is quietly haunted by the memory of how terribly they treated you, they do not process that memory through quiet contemplation or emotional processing. Instead, the sudden resurgence of that unaddressed shame activates their central nervous system's threat response. Because their brain cannot tolerate the internal pressure of knowing they were the perpetrator of unfairness, abuse, or deceit, it executes an immediate cognitive transfer. They project that internal toxicity outward, initiating an unprovoked strike against you before you even have a chance to bring up the past. This behavioral dynamic explains why you can be completely silent, living your life miles away with zero contact, and suddenly hear that your former partner or associate has launched a smear campaign, posted a passive-aggressive statement, or made bizarre claims to mutual acquaintances about your character. To an untrained observer, this looks like random, unprovoked hostility. However, through a precise behavioral lens, this sudden spike in hostility is a direct response to a hidden trigger. Something in their immediate environment, a song, a location, a fleeting thought, or seeing you succeed, force the memory of their past conduct toward you into their conscious awareness. The moment that memory surfaced, bringing its associated wave of core shame, their psychological defense mechanisms executed an emergency protocol. To insulate themselves from feeling like the villain, they must immediately reconstruct the narrative to make you the villain. Preemptive deflection is an aggressive, tactical attempt to control the public and private narrative before their own guilt can be exposed. They begin spreading lies, twisting old arguments, or accusing you of the exact abusive behaviors they committed against you. If they can convince everyone around them, and most importantly, convince their own fragile ego that you are crazy, bitter, or dangerous, then their past mistreatment of you becomes justified in their mind. They rewrite the script so that their cruel actions were merely self-defense against your supposed toxicity. When you observe this pattern, you are watching a person desperately trying to outrun their own conscience. The hostility you see on the surface is simply the outer shield protecting a deeply terrified core. A person who is genuinely at peace with their past actions has no need to launch preemptive strikes, monitor an ex-partner's life, or actively assassinate someone's character long after a dynamic has ended. Quiet confidence produces indifference. Unprovoked, preemptive deflection, on the other hand, is the clear signature of a mind in constant panic, actively fighting to suppress the realization of what they did to you. The ultimate phase of recovering from a dynamic with a narcissist is executing a total shift in your own psychological orientation, moving away from seeking external validation and stepping into absolute emotional authority. When you spend months or years waiting for an admission of guilt, an honest conversation, or a clear apology, you are inadvertently leaving your psychological state tethered to a deeply compromised source. You are placing the key to your emotional closure inside the hands of the very person who demonstrated a complete lack of integrity. Reclaiming your sovereignty requires analyzing the situation through an objective behavioral framework rather than an emotional one, allowing you to see their silence not as a reflection of your worth, but as definitive proof of their psychological limitations. When an individual mistreats you and subsequently acts as if you never existed, your internal emotional system naturally attempts to make sense of the void. The brain naturally seeks cause and effect loops, leading you to ask questions like, was I not valuable enough for them to care? Or, why was it so easy for them to discard me without a second thought? This line of questioning is fundamentally flawed because it assumes the other party possesses the emotional machinery required to process reality accurately. Through a precise diagnostic lens, their inability to offer an apology or acknowledge the harm they caused is not evidence that you were insignificant. It is direct, observable evidence of their utter incapacity to survive self-scrutiny. They ran away from the truth of how they treated you because that truth contained a level of shame, accountability, and exposure that their fragile ego structure could not tolerate. When you fully internalize this reality, the dynamic instantly flips. You no longer see their stone-cold silence, their grandstanding, or their superficial displays of happiness as signs of victory or strength. Instead, you recognize those behaviors as the heavy, cumbersome armor of someone locked in a perpetual state of internal evasion. They are permanently trapped inside a prison of their own denial, forced to continuously manufacture new lies, seek new distractions, and build new illusions, just to stay one step ahead of their own unaddressed shame. Stepping into psychological sovereignty means recognizing that you do not need a confession from a compromised witness to validate your reality. You were present during the dynamic, you experienced the mistreatment, and your perception of events is fully intact. You do not require their stamp of approval or a formal surrender to grant yourself permission to move forward. The moment you stop expecting an emotionally bankrupt person to pay a debt of accountability, you take complete operational control of your own mental state. You allow them to carry the weight of their own hidden shame while you retain total clarity, freedom, and emotional independence.